In episode 54, titled Navigate GDPR and Jurisdictional Requirements Without Guessing or Overreaching, privacy law is treated as a set of constraints that shapes how data work is designed and operated. These constraints influence what data is collected, how it is processed, where it can be stored, and who can access it, long before anyone creates a dashboard or runs an analysis. In practice, privacy requirements create boundaries that can either be handled cleanly through process or handled poorly through improvisation, which is where risk tends to grow. The goal is to build a mindset where the team can act confidently without pretending to be lawyers, because confident guessing is still guessing. A useful starting point is defining personal data in plain terms as information tied to an individual, directly or indirectly, through identifiers or linkable attributes. This includes obvious items like names and email addresses, but it also includes identifiers that can single someone out when combined with other data, which is why context matters. The core idea is that if a record can be reasonably connected back to a person, the handling expectations become stricter, even if the data feels technical rather than personal. That framing helps teams avoid the common error of treating telemetry, logs, and user behavior signals as harmless simply because they are not formatted like a contact list. Lawful basis concepts sit underneath most privacy programs, and the practical lesson is that purpose matters because it limits what is appropriate to do with the data. Many organizations describe common lawful bases such as consent, contract necessity, legal obligation, legitimate interests, and similar categories. But the operational takeaway is that data should not be repurposed casually once it is collected. Purpose defines why the data exists in the first place, and that purpose shapes what fields are needed, how long records are retained, and which recipients are appropriate. When purpose is unclear or silently expands over time, teams end up with mission creep that raises privacy exposure and makes compliance evidence harder to produce. A privacy-aware analyst learns to treat purpose as part of the dataset's definition, not as a footnote. Jurisdiction becomes real when teams can track where data resides, because location affects which rules may apply and which stakeholders must be involved. Data residency is not only about where a customer lives, it includes where systems store records, where replicas exist, and where administrators can access data from. This gets complicated fast in cloud environments, where workloads may span regions and where backups and logs can create secondary copies outside the primary system. When location is unknown, teams tend to speak in vague generalities, which often leads to either under-compliance or over-restriction that blocks legitimate work. Clear mapping of storage regions and access pathways turns jurisdiction from a guess into an observable system property. Collection limits follow naturally from purpose, because limiting collection to what the purpose truly requires reduces both privacy risk and operational complexity. Overcollection is common because fields feel cheap to add at ingestion time, yet every extra attribute becomes something that must be protected, documented, and eventually deleted. A minimalist collection posture also improves data quality because the pipeline spends less time handling irrelevant fields, and fewer teams have reasons to touch sensitive columns. This is where privacy and engineering hygiene align, since smaller, clearer datasets are easier to govern and easier to explain in audits. When the purpose sentence is strong, collection decisions become easier because nice-to-have fields are less likely to slip through. Access, correction, and deletion request workflows are another place where privacy becomes operational rather than theoretical, because they require the organization to locate and act on an individual's data across systems. Requests often involve verifying identity, scoping which systems are in play, and producing consistent outcomes across primary stores, replicas, and derived datasets such as analytics tables. This is also where governance practices like lineage and sources of truth pay off, since a team that can trace data flows can respond more reliably than a team relying on memory. A mature workflow handles timing, exceptions, and evidence because response obligations are judged by what can be shown and repeated. When these workflows are designed early, the reporting environment becomes less fragile under pressure. Minimization and retention are powerful risk controls because they reduce privacy exposure over time, even when nothing else changes. Minimization is about limiting what is collected and shared, while retention is about limiting how long data stays stored, including in backups and reporting layers. These practices reduce breach impact by shrinking the amount of personal data available to be exposed and by limiting how far back an attacker's view can extend. They also reduce the internal risk of inappropriate use because fewer people and fewer systems have access to sensitive information. When minimization and retention are treated as standard design inputs, privacy becomes part of normal engineering trade-offs rather than a last-minute compliance scramble. A marketing list scenario makes jurisdiction and purpose risks feel concrete because marketing data often includes personal identifiers and often crosses systems quickly. Consider a list built from signups, purchases, web events, and support interactions, then enriched and segmented for campaigns, which can create a complex web of derived fields. If the purpose is not clear, teams may mix sources that were collected for different reasons, creating a compliance and trust problem when customers receive unexpected messaging. Jurisdiction adds complexity when the list includes individuals from multiple regions, because rights expectations and consent standards may differ depending on where the individual is located and where the organization operates. In that environment, clean documentation of provenance, consent signals, and retention logic becomes essential for defensible decisions. Cross-border transfers deserve careful handling because they combine legal constraints with technical controls, and both matter for risk management. Approved mechanisms can include tools such as standard contractual clauses, SCCs, and other transfer frameworks used by organizations, but the practical lesson is that transfer decisions should be paired with access controls, encryption, monitoring, and vendor oversight. A transfer mechanism on paper is weaker if the data is widely accessible, copied into uncontrolled environments, or exported without audit trails. This is where storage mapping and replication inventory matter, since untracked replicas can turn a controlled transfer into uncontrolled spread. Teams that treat cross-border movement as a traceable, governed flow are less likely to discover surprises during audits or incidents. Consent and preference changes should be documented with clear timestamps because timing is how teams prove what was true when a decision was made. If a person opts in, opts out, or changes preferences, downstream systems need to reflect that state consistently, and the evidence needs to show when the change occurred and when systems honored it. Time-stamped records also protect the organization from confusion during disputes, since a campaign sent after an opt-out feels very different from a campaign sent before the opt-out was processed. The operational goal is to avoid floating consent states that vary by system, because that inconsistency creates both compliance risk and customer trust damage. When timestamps and lineage are reliable, the organization can explain behavior without hand-waving. Avoiding legal claims is a practical discipline for data professionals, because overconfident statements create risk when they are later treated as promises. A safer posture is to focus on policy and process, describing what the organization's approved handling rules are, how data is classified, how retention is set, and how access is controlled. This keeps the work grounded in what can be observed and repeated, such as whether a dataset is minimized, whether deletion runs are verified, and whether transfers are tracked and governed. It also keeps teams aligned with the right experts, since legal interpretation belongs with Privacy Counsel and designated privacy leadership. When language stays precise and process-based, reporting and analytics can move forward without drifting into legal overreach. When requirements feel unclear, coordination with privacy teams is not a slowdown, but a control that prevents expensive rework later. Uncertainty often appears when a dataset combines multiple purposes, spans multiple regions, or includes sensitive categories that raise higher expectations. Privacy partners can clarify policy boundaries, acceptable basis for processing, and the right handling mechanisms, while data teams can provide system maps, lineage, and practical options for minimization. This collaboration works best when the conversation is framed in concrete terms, such as which fields are collected, where they flow, who can access them, and how long they persist. Clear inputs produce clear guidance, and clear guidance produces stable implementation. A privacy-aware data handling mindset can be summarized as designing for restraint, traceability, and repeatability. Restraint means collecting and retaining only what is needed for a defined purpose and treating sensitive data as something that should remain rare and controlled. Traceability means knowing where data came from, where it resides, where it replicates, and how results are derived so decisions and responses can be defended. Repeatability means that workflows for access requests, correction, deletion, and incident response are consistent and evidence-backed rather than improvised. When these three ideas guide everyday choices, teams reduce privacy risk while still delivering useful analytics and reporting. To conclude, one practical privacy check to add to intake is a short, consistent step that asks whether the dataset contains personal data, what purpose justifies its use, where it will be stored and replicated, and what retention window applies. That check is valuable because it forces early clarity on jurisdictional exposure, consent or preference handling, and whether minimization opportunities exist before the pipeline becomes entrenched. It also creates a record that privacy partners and auditors can understand later, since it captures intent, scope, and controls at the moment the work began. Over time, this simple intake check becomes a habit that prevents guesswork and reduces the temptation to overreach when privacy questions appear under deadline pressure. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.